Hi, welcome to today's On This Day in Tudor History with me, Claire Ridgway, author of On This Day in Tudor History. Where am I taking you today? Well, I'm taking you back to King Henry VII's reign, so the first Tudor monarch. For on this day in Tudor history, the 24th of September 1486, Arthur, Prince of Wales, son of Henry VII, was christened at a lavish ceremony at Winchester Cathedral. Arthur had been born on the 20th of September, which you'll know from my On This Day in Tudor History from the 20th of September, but he wasn't baptised straight away because his intended godfather, John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford, needed time to travel from Suffolk to Winchester. On the day, those taking part gathered in Queen Elizabeth of York's apartments, while Arthur's grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, who was standing as his godmother, waited at the cathedral. After 3 hours, the Earl of Oxford still hadn't arrived, so the king ordered Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, and the baby's step-grandfather to stand in for Oxford. Shortly after the baby had been baptised and named, Oxford arrived and was able to present Arthur for his confirmation. The party then processed to the shrine of St. Swithin, the cathedral's saint, where hymns were sung, and then they enjoyed the traditional spices, hippocras, and wine. The baby, held by his Aunt Cecily, was processed past burning torches back to his nursery and to his mother. Now, during Elizabeth of York's pregnancy, Arthur's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, had written a set of ordinances for the birth of a prince or princess and the subsequent christening. These ordinances set out in detail the preparations to be made for the Queen's confinement down to minuscule details, how the church should be arrayed for the christening service, and what the child would need in his or her nursery. Her ordinances, which still survive today, give us an insight into Arthur's christening on that day in 1486. According to Margaret, the church was to be hanged with rich arras or cloth of gold in the best manner, and the altar to be arrayed in the same manner. The chancel was to be well carpeted throughout, and large and long carpets were to be laid at the church door. The porch was to be hanged and sealed with rich cloth of gold or arras. On one side of the church, leading up to the font, Margaret says must be hanged a traverse, which I think must be a gallery or deck, traverse, furnished with carpets and cushions. There was to be a pan of coals burnt before the service to perfume the church, and chaffrons of water and basins of silver and gilt to wash the child if needs be. Margaret gave instructions for the font of silver from Canterbury to be sent for in advance, or, if that wasn't possible, a new font to be made for the purpose and kept for future use. If the king wished, then a font of stone could be used instead. Whatever the font was made of, it was to be covered all over the bottom with soft reins, cloth of reins, in diverse folds, and set at a great height, so that the people in the church could see the christening. It was also to be hanged with cloth of gold, and over it a great and large canopy of damask, satin, or reins, the border being cloth of gold well embroidered. The infant was to be given a little taper to carry in his hands up to the altar after his christening, I assume with some help. At the service, the infant was to be carried by a duchess, and another duchess was to bear the chrism, the christening cloth, on her shoulder, on top of a kerchief of small reins. If the infant was a prince, as in the case of Arthur, an earl was to bear the train of the mantle, which was to be rich cloth of gold with a long train furred throughout with ermine. If the infant was a princess, then a countess was to bear the train. 200 torches were to be carried into the church before the infant, of which 24 were to be carried around the child by esquires. The christening party was then to gather at the font in order. The sergeant of the king or queen's pantry was to be ready with a fair towel of reins about his neck and a salt cellar in his hand, ready for the salt to be blessed. The treasurer of the household was to go before him and present the salt for blessing. The sergeant of the Uri was to be ready in the church with basins, both covered and uncovered, for the bishops to wash in. The sergeant of the spicery and the butler were to be ready with spice and wine for the christening party. The prince or princess was to be received at the church porch by the bishops, and when the solemnities were over, a canopy was to be carried over the child by 4 knights or esquires as they processed to the traverse. There, fire and water were to be prepared so that the child could be changed and readied for christening. While this was going on, the font was to be hallowed by the Abbot of Westminster or someone in his stead before the child was brought forth. After the christening, the torches and the infant's taper were to be lit and the infant taken to the altar to make an offering of money and to be confirmed. The infant was then to be taken back to the traverse where spices and wine would be enjoyed. The infant and gifts would then be taken to the Queen's chamber door. If the infant was a princess, the gifts would be carried to the Queen by the ladies, and if the infant was a prince, then the gifts would be carried by the earls. The infant was to be processed to the Queen's chamber with lit torches and a canopy carried over it. Once the gifts had been presented and the infant brought back from the church, the little prince or princess was to be carried to the nursery to be fed by the wet nurse with the lady governess of the nursery and a dry nurse in attendance. I can imagine those organising this christening checking and double-checking Margaret's ordinances to make sure everything was right, can't you? I think Margaret might have been a little bit of a control freak. Lady Margaret Beaufort's ordinances are such a wonderful resource on the preparations for the birth and christening of a royal baby. So I think we have to say a big thank you to her, and it is so wonderful that these ordinances have survived. So on this day in Tudor history, in 1486, we have the christening of Prince Arthur, Arthur Tudor, son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Thank you for joining me. You can, of course, subscribe to the channel by clicking round about there. And please do subscribe. I really ask you to subscribe because it really does make a lot of difference to the way that YouTube brings up my videos for other people to see. You can, of course, like this video and you can hit the bell to be notified as videos go live. Thank you for following what I do, and I'll be back tomorrow with another Tudor history event for you. See you then. Bye-bye. The church was to be hanged with rich arras, I can't say it. According to Margaret, the church was to be hanged with rich arras or cloth, I can't say it. We have the christening of Prince Arthur.